Okay, last night on divorce, this is week 7, and then at the end I'll tell you what the next subject is going to be, which I'm excited about. But I had somebody I was talking to the other day ask me what I was teaching at the moment on Wednesday nights, and I told them I was teaching on divorce, and they're a Church of Christ fella. So they asked, they said, okay, well, what did you decide the exceptions are? And I said, well, it's just not that simple, it seems to me. Come on in. Sit down. Have a seat, Cam. Welcome. Glad you could make it. Nice sweatshirt. You could have worn short sleeves. You wouldn't have to roll them up.
I know, right?
You know what I mean? Hey, how's it going? All right. So, what are the exceptions? It's just not that simple. It's more complicated than that. Jesus gave us that real sexual immorality is an exception for divorce being adultery. Paul knows that teaching and then gives us another exception based on the scenario that they were facing. So Paul sees Jesus' words not as exclusive, as some sort of ritual, but he sees Jesus' words as a rule of which there could be exceptions. Like when Jesus said, anyone who says calls someone a fool is liable to the hell of fire of the fires of hell. And then in Matthew 23, he does that. Or when he says, don't resist evil, but then we're told to resist the devil. So there are rules, but the fact that there is a rule doesn't mean that there's not exceptions to the rule. So we have Jesus' rule of sexual immorality being the only exception, but Paul knows that rule and then adds his own exception for a particular circumstance. We looked at this from lots of different angles, so if you haven't been here for all the times, you want to go back and listen, it will probably help. But we dove deeply into 1 Corinthians 7, which I think is the key text. I told you that a lot of the reason that we did this study was to help me know how to operate confidently as a minister in the sphere of marriage and divorce in particular. And I told you my kind of answer for myself, how I'm moving forward is the call is to stay married except for hard-heartedness or a lack of repentance in real sexual immorality or real neglect. And I say real sexual immorality because we talked about that word, sexual immorality, translated Matthew 19, Matthew 5, as the Greek word porneia, which it means sexual immorality. It's more than just adultery, but it's also not exactly sexual immorality. The sexual immorality is a little bit too broad for porneia, it seems. It seems like it's a mixture of the English words sexual immorality and what we would call a sex act, right? So there's a physical action. It seems to be played in porneia. We don't have an example of that word ever used for something that's not an actual action being taken. And so just sort of mental lust, I don't think fits into that category for that reason. But we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Okay, let me deal with a few more common questions, and then we'll be done with this series. And I'll bump through the ones that I don't think you're really thinking about quickly, like this first one. But a common objection is, if the Old Testament punishment for adultery was death, which it was. If the Old Testament punishment for death was adultery, then, what did I say? Punishment for adultery was death, then how could adultery be cause for divorce? Which is a good objection. The problem is we know that it wasn't practiced generally, and it definitely wasn't practiced by AD 30. We have multiple Jewish texts that at the point of AD 30 were saying that not only do we not do it anymore, but even that you shouldn't do it anymore. And probably the reason for that was because Rome wouldn't let them do it. And so they started reasoning their way out of it. Look at John chapter 18, for instance. John chapter 18. While you're getting there. So a couple of big Jewish writings from the first century are called the Talmud and the Mishnah. Both of them talk about how they weren't practicing the death penalty for adultery anymore, even arguing against it. The Mishnah had a law that said a woman, if she committed adultery, she couldn't marry the man she committed adultery with, which is interesting, but also would mean, of course, that she's not dead. So, John 18, verse 31. Says, Pilate said to them, take him yourselves, this is about Jesus, of course, and judge him by your own law. The Jews said to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. So the reason Jesus was crucified and not stoned, which he should have been by the Jewish law if he was a blasphemer, is because the Jews weren't allowed by Rome to kill anybody. They weren't allowed to carry out the death penalty. Rome wouldn't let them do that. Rome let them do a lot, wouldn't let them do that. And so they had to go to Pilate, to the Roman governors, if they wanted to get Jesus killed. And so he was crucified because that was a Roman way of killing when the Jews weren't allowed to do so. So why, if adultery penalty was death, why does that play in here? Because they weren't practicing that. They weren't practicing that law anymore, and that's pretty clear. Okay, secondly, and I just kind of hit on this a minute ago, is pornography addiction grounds for divorce? This is difficult because obviously you'd be justifying mass divorce as it's an epidemic. It was an issue in the first century, but it is now. It's hard to express how serious it is that pornography addiction is, or even just non-addiction, if that's possible. It's hard to express how serious that is in all sorts of ways, biblically certainly, but also psychologically. But it's not physical or even relational normally. It does seem like it's more than just lust because you're pursuing it. There's some complications there I don't really know how to work out. I think it's worse than just basic lust because it's something you're pursuing in that way. But it doesn't fit into the porneia umbrella of what that word means. So my current view is that pornography is more evil than you think it is, more atrocious and cruel and self-absorbed and everything that Christ isn't than you think it is. It's a sin that must be dealt with. It is cancerous to the Christian very often, but it's not generally grounds for divorce. Maybe in extreme cases, but then you get into the elders' situation of real neglect and elders using wisdom. Okay. Questions on those two before I move forward? Pumping through them today, baby. Just got 3 more, but the third one will take a little time. Okay. First one, this is just tied to the one before this, is voluntary sexual deprival reason for divorce. So you have 2 spouses who are able to physically sleep together, but one denies it utterly. Same basic answer, where the answer is not normally, but in extreme cases, maybe. David Instone Brewer would say yes. He's the one that focused on Exodus 21 and the passage about neglect of the vows made to marriage. And one of the vows the Jews made from the beginning was vows to provide for your spouse intimately. And if you fail to do that, you're breaking your vow. And so Brewer would say yes to that question. If it was real in that case, if it was real neglect, it would fall in that category. I'm less willing to do that. But I want to give the same answer of saying generally no, but maybe in extreme cases there's some elder wisdom to be used. Okay, last 2, and these will take a little more time, which we talked about this a little bit before, but does husband of one wife, look at 1 Timothy, does husband of one wife, the requirement for elders and deacons, mean divorced people can't be either one? Okay, does it mean that divorced people can't be either one? Now, in the sermon a few weeks ago in 1 Timothy 2, I told you that I think churches can pretty freely disagree on this. I don't think it's ironclad. I think it's good for us to submit to our elders in the decision they come to in this. I think this is a good example of that. But we're here, so let's talk about it. I mentioned that what I think is saying, that the view I lean to, and there's a few different views. The view I lean towards is what's being said there is simply a sexually faithful man. A man who is faithful in the sexual realm is what's in view. For a variety of reasons. The words that are there is one woman, man. There's 3 Greek words. One is the word one is the word woman, one is the word man. And that seems to be, I think, the idea at play. It's also interesting that all the qualifications given in these qualifications for elders and deacons are about present quality, right? So it's about what this man is like today. So if it says not quarrelsome, some people would say that this hasn't gone away. But 10 years ago, I was quite quarrelsome, for instance. But I'm less quarrelsome now because of Jesus. And hopefully in 30 years, I'll be even less quarrelsome. I will be if I keep following the Lord. And so we wouldn't disqualify someone from the role of deacon or elder because they used to be quarrelsome. Because all these qualifications are about who they are today, obviously. We need a man who is like this today, whose character has been like this for a significant period of time. This isn't new, but it is about present character. And so if this one was the only one that wasn't about present character, it would at least be odd. Okay, there's that point. It would be weird that it's the one thing that would rule out somebody based on past failures, where someone may have murdered but did not be disqualified because they're no longer a quarrelsome or angry person. I do think divorce is generally a weight on the side against them for leadership. I think that's fair to say. It's a weight on the side of weighing them against them generally. But here's the main argument. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9. So we talked about how in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul's main argument is he wishes everybody could be single because you're more devoted to the Lord. And how weird it would be if deacons couldn't be single when Paul was single and Jesus was single. elders by extension. It'd be odd. It doesn't seem like Paul is saying that. He doesn't say you have to be married. Again, it seems like he's giving qualifications for what them look like. Again, with it being illegal to be single in Rome, single people that were grown men were very rare. Very rare. Even widowers would tend to get remarried pretty quickly. So Paul was, in that sense, probably just speaking to the majority of people. Again, it's not that way today necessarily. But chapter 5, verse 9, we have the same exact words used about widows. And so whenever we make of 1 Timothy 2 and 3, one woman man, 3 and 4, just 3, one woman man, we must do this. We must apply the same interpretational tactic to whatever is meant here in 1 Timothy 5, verse 9. Let a widow be enrolled if she's not less than 60 years of age, having been a one-man woman, the wife of one husband. Same words there. Having been the wife of one husband, having been a one-man woman, and having a reputation for good works. Now, here's why that's significant. If what husband of one wife means is you can only have been married, that you must be married, and you only have been married once. We're all across the scale here. Some people say you have to still be married, so that if your wife dies, you're no longer qualified. Which, if you're going to take it literally, you kind of need to say that. But if you say it means you can only ever have one wife, then this passage also means the widow could only ever have had one husband in order to be enrolled on the church's funds. Right? So if this widow had two husbands and widowed both of them, she can't be benefited. She can't be a part of the beneficiaries of the church. She can't be enrolled on the widow list. But I think that's very odd that we would say that. I don't think we would say that, especially when, look down at verse 14 of chapter 5, Paul says, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give their adversary no occasion for slander. And so young widows, who are young women who have lost their husbands, which was much more common at the time, obviously, Paul says, you should remarry. That's what I would have you do, remarry. But if verse 9 or verse 10 means, verse 9 means that she can only be married once to be enrolled, he's now disqualified them from ever being enrolled. He's told them to remarry, and now they'll never be able to be helped by the church. So if Paul says, you should remarry, and then he dies the next day, she's now 30 years old, unable to ever be helped by the church, unable to get a job, unable to be helped. I don't think we would ever apply it that way. We haven't, as churches, as our tribe, applied it to widows, like we applied it to elders and deacons, even though it's the exact same Greek phrase. Obviously in reverse, one man, woman, as opposed to one woman, man. So I say that to say, I don't think what can be meant there is that you only have been married once. I think that's out of the possibilities of what's meant by a husband of one wife or a one woman man. And I think whatever we apply in 1 Timothy 4, we must apply to 1 Timothy 5 with widows. So we must be consistent there. So because of that, especially 1 Timothy 5, I think what's being said is that the widow was sexually faithful and is sexually faithful and is faithful in the sexual realm. And the same thing is true of the man that we're looking for. Again, I think in all these cases, when you're looking for deacons or elders, you're measuring the men against the qualifications, and it's a weight on the side against the man in general, but it's not necessarily disqualifying. If he meant you couldn't be divorced, Paul could have just said the man can't have been divorced. It would have been. It's very odd that he used this language if he meant something else. Okay, now flip to the question that when I started this series, someone asked me about it, and I said, I don't know. I don't know yet at all. I'll see when I get there. And that was true of a few ones, but especially this one. Flip to Ezra chapter 10. Now, any thoughts on the husband and one wife thing? Anybody want to make any points on that, or any combatants? Again, I hold that one more loosely, but I think there's a good reason for it. Yeah.
Elders and deacons can be remarried.
Up to the elders, but I'm saying it's not clear that they're disqualified. That's what I want to say. It's not clear that one woman man has anything to do with your past.
But they usually are.
Yeah, they have been historically in our tribe in particular. I would say probably in most churches that's been the case. Not in all churches, but in most churches it's been treated at least in some way in having to do with divorce. Also, by the way, I think the widow one rules out polygamy probably because there were no polygamous women. So it would seem odd if he used that same phrase. Anyway, so those are kind of opinions, and you know what opinions are good for. All right. Ezra 10. Starting in verse 2. Shechaniah. There's a good name for a kid. The son of Jehiel, another good name. Of the sons of Elam, addressed Ezra. We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives. We've talked about this some, but that put away just means divorce, and that's made clear later. But to put away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Okay, so we need to do it, but we're going to do it the right way, the way Moses told us to. Verse 4, arise, for it's your task, and we're with you, be strong and do it. Then Ezra arose and made the leading priests and Levites and all Israel take an oath that they would do as had been said, and they took an oath. Okay, now, I want you to realize what has just been said, because it's tough, interesting. We have the people of Israel saying, okay, the whole book of Ezra and Nehemiah, by the way, is the story of Israel going back to the land and kind of becoming the kingdom of God again. And so they're being renewed with the law. They're turning back to the Lord. It's these books about repentance and about doing things right again. And so people come before and they say, we've married women we shouldn't have married. Let us put them away. And so I want you to imagine the scene. Right? This isn't just a story. This is not just academic. This actually happened. Okay? I want you to imagine verse 9. Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within the 3-day period. It was the 9th month on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. I love those little details, those little historical details that shouldn't be there if the story's made up, but it's just thrown in there. We have those throughout the Bible. Trembling because of the matter and because of the heavy rain. Verse 10, and Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you have broken faith and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now then make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of this land and from the foreign wives. Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, it's so, we must do as you said. But the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open, nor is this a task for 1 day or for 2, for we have greatly transgressed in this matter. Let our officials stand for the whole assembly. Let all in our cities who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times, and with them the elders and judges of every city, until the fierce wrath of God over this matter is turned away from us. Only Jonathan the son of Ahil, a couple of men that objected. Verse 16, then the returned exiles did so. Ezra the priest selected men, heads of fathers' houses, according to their fathers' houses, each of them designated by name. On the first day of the 10th month, they sat down to examine the matter. And by the first day of the first month, they had come to the end of all the men who had married foreign women. Okay. Look at the last verse, just for the finality. Look down at verse 44. It lists all these people, 112 marriages. All these had married foreign women, and some of them had even born children. Some of them had even born children, he says. Okay. So we have this case where God commands, through Ezra, mass divorce. Now, some people make it seem like it's thousands. It was 100, but still obviously significant and interesting for our discussion. There is a group of people, not a lot in the scholarly world, but there's a group of people that try to say that Ezra was going against God. But we don't get any indication of that in the scripture. It always seems like Ezra, who is the man of God throughout the book, always doing good, restoring the people, is leading this charge. There's no reason to think that he's going against God in doing this, as easy as that would be, as convenient as it would be. There's no biblical reason to think that. But what we have here is interesting in that if it was as simple as maybe it seems at first glance, they married foreign wives, they got to divorce them, then they could have just made it so and declared a law, said you must divorce in the next, 2 weeks or 3 days, like they said for the gathering. But they don't do that. What happens is very interesting. What happens is they get all of these marriages that have married foreign women, 112 of them, and they separate them to the cities, to the elders and the judges of their cities. And even then, separated, they examine each case, and it takes them 3 months. 3 months. So it wasn't like they just said, well, you got to divorce them. What seems to have occurred is all these elders and wise men got together with these men and their new wives, and they examined each case to see if divorce was required. If what was required, and what that means, we aren't really told what that means, what exactly they were doing. But they had to examine more than if they were just a non-Israelite, because that wouldn't have taken any time. They probably considered, well, is this woman fully pagan? Is she against us religiously? Or was she like Rahab, who was not an Israelite but became one in faith? Was she converted? Was she like Ruth or Moses' wife? Were the kids being raised under the covenant of Israel? Were they being raised as part of the people of God, as part of the covenant? Did the man abandon a previous wife in order to marry this one? Is there now a woman who is hurt? So all these things, it's almost like, by the way, that God has set up elders and wise people to help us out throughout the way with difficult situations. But it's all these wise people that are elders in charge of these families get together and say, okay, this is tough. What are we going to do? And they look at every single case and they ask these questions. Is this woman an Israelite? Is she against our God? And so are the children against our God? Are they part of the covenant? And at the end result, they have these 112 marriages that end up being divorced. This whole chapter, this is treated as extreme, right? It seems extreme to us. It seemed extreme to them. There's people saying, I don't know if we should do this. There's objectors. There's language like, there are even some that had children. There's this very extreme, what we're going to call exceptional language, this extreme language. What we're doing here is exceptional, is extreme, is shocking. The whole chapter is like that. Now, here's, I think, the best explanation for this. We have Israel here, the people of God, which is not us, by the way, not America. What Israel was different than any nation will ever be. No nation will be in a covenant with God the way Israel was. No nation will have laws like that the way Israel did, etc. Except if you're premillennial, but that's a different conversation. So they examine these things, and then they re-enter the land of Israel, which was a massive deal, the land that God had promised them, that they had known about from generation to generation. They have gotten back to this land, the land that God has given him, and this land through which Jesus is going to come. Right? Jesus is going to be born in this land, and this is where this is going to take place, all these, obviously, messianic promises. And the land is being divided up amongst the ancestors of Israel, among the people of Israel. The genealogy was important. Who begot who, right? Israel was big on that because land was being passed down based on where you fit into Israel's genealogy. If your children were pagan, if your wife and children were not Israelites, were pagan, then by giving them land, you are essentially, we talk about here, they're essentially giving the land to pagans. The land that God has given Israel is being given away piece by piece to pagans, to non-Israelites, to non-people of God. Look at chapter 9, verse 12. Therefore, do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it, the land, for an inheritance to your children forever. That the land. So this land is a central part of restoring the faith of the people of God. All right, the key one I think though is in chapter 10, verse 8, where I want you to see the punishment. So if anyone said, look, I married the pagan wife. Yeah, she's a pagan. She doesn't believe what we believe. I'm staying with her. If anyone said that, which they could, they wouldn't kill him or anything. They had the freedom to do that. But if they did that, look at the punishment. If anyone does not come within 3 days, that is, if anyone does not come to the assembly, by order of the officials and the elders, all of his property should be forfeited, and he himself banned from the congregation of the exiles. That is, he is no longer an Israelite. He is no longer in the covenant of God. He is giving up his land. Okay, so he could stay with the foreign wife. It wasn't forced divorces. But if they chose to stay with the foreign wife, the one who was against God, presumably, then he was choosing to give up his inheritance, give up his property, so that the land of God remains the land of God, not the land of pagans. Okay, so what does that mean for us today? Virtually nothing, right? Really, it means we have an exceptional, special case with the people of Israel that does not apply to us in almost any way. The only way it does apply to us is it at least tells us that divorce is possible because God commanded it, and that divorce is not inherently, ontologically sinful, because God commanded it. So those are probably the two things we can glean from that. Not much else. Certainly not anything for us in modern day divorces, because this situation is peculiar to the covenant people of God and their land. All right. Thoughts?
Okay, divorce is nice, but you married. So you can't get along somebody, divorce them. Okay.
In general, the remarriage is when it's called adultery.
I agree with what you said, but it's got a lot to do with your pitch. Certain things I believe don't matter.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What I felt.
Sure.
It'd be wrong if I felt it was wrong.
Yeah, Romans 14. Yep, that's true.
Just like we're gonna use the argument that we've always held the overwhelming statement that our elders not have been remarried.
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly know that divorce is actually wrong.
Yeah, I agree. That's part of the historical. Yeah, that's true. And again, history is good to a point, but obviously we want to be biblical more than we want to be historical. What else? Look at me. It's the first time I've ever finished early, I think. All right, Dr. White. Yeah, so I think abuse fits into the. Let's look back at Exodus 21 quickly. So I said that my position as a minister is going to be divorce. You shouldn't divorce except for hard-heartedness in sexual immorality, porneia, or real neglect. And the neglect idea comes primarily from Exodus 21, where verse 10 says, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish. So this is a man who's taking another wife on top of the wife he already has. He shall not diminish the food, the clothing, or the marital rights of the first wife, which are the three things that Jews vowed to do when they got married. So every Jewish wedding, when you get married, you vow three things. You vow to, the husband provides to provide food. The wife vows, I don't know if this is modern day, by the way, but this is certainly true then. The husband vows to provide food. The wife vows to cook it. The husband vows to provide cloth. The wife vows to sew it. The husband and wife both vow to give each other their marital rights, as well as be faithful alone to each other. And so David and Stone Brewer is a scholar that takes that principle and says what's being said there is the man can't neglect his former wife. Right? He can't deprive her of food, deprive her of clothing. And the natural implication there is that abuse, that real abuse, falls into the category of neglect, of real neglect. Sir? By either one? Oh, sure, yeah. So I say real neglect because that, pun intended, I guess, that is abused very often, where he said some mean things, so he's emotionally abusive. And then you're right. So I think elders should be involved in all these decisions about what exactly constitutes real neglect. Is this real neglect? Is this real hard-heartedness? I think we should have wisdom in all those things. But I feel real good about fitting abuse into that category. Additionally, we said, last thing I'll say on this is, unless there's another question, when Jesus said to the Pharisees, what man here would not pick a goat out of the hole if it fell on the Sabbath, even though by technical rule. So he said it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The point of the Sabbath was not to keep you from doing good. It was to glorify the Lord and point your eyes back to the Lord and give you the opportunity to rest. So he says it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. I think that it's a parallel conclusion to say it's lawful to do good by getting a woman away that's her life being threatened by abuse in a case of marriage. And there's more to be said there about there's exceptions made throughout the Bible when safety is in play. So yeah, I think that fits into that umbrella.
Because marriage, it was started in abuse.
What do you mean?
For example, if a man raped a woman, he had to marry her and he could not divorce her. And that was because once you done like that, it's considered unworthy.
Yeah.
So, how would you? Does that not seem
that particular? The particular law is obviously, as you know, it's an Old Testament law, so it doesn't apply directly to us. But in all those cases, we have a situation there that's not as applicable today, and so I think you have a good case of the elders dealing with that. Right. So today, a woman that was raped wouldn't be in the dire circumstances that she would have been. Obviously, it's not. I'm not saying it's good, but you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. Wouldn't have been in the dire livelihood circumstances she would have been then. So God does what He has to protect the woman then, but that's less necessary now. So there's this opportunity for elders to make a decision and to help in those cases, and even just parents to help in those cases. Like we talked about in Exodus somewhere last week, where if a man slept with a virgin who was not betrothed, but the father didn't want the man to marry her, then he could say no, right? I think that is a good application for it today.
So that was applicable. I don't know if that could have been applicable in that situation.
Yeah.
What the Father could have said.
Yeah.
No.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Lou,
That would make sense.
I think so. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. Adultery? Yes. But yeah. Yes.
I was just thinking like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it does. You look at the info out there, you can talk to someone. It usually leads to,
Yeah, I agree.
and so like, it usually leads to.
Yeah.
Earlier, it's an ongoing issue. Worse.
Yeah.
And then, but how do you do?
Yeah, so I think Jesus does that for a reason. Where if you're in Matthew 5, you can see how quickly. So the passage that's just mentioned is verse 27 through 30, and then the very next section is when Jesus says, "I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery." So, and what we have in the previous section is the anger is murder comparison, right? And then we have the lust is, and so like Luann says, of course, rightly, that what Jesus is saying is it's at the heart of the matter that's really the issue, right? But it's not, he uses different words when he talks about lust earlier, he talks about sexual immorality later, right? So there is a difference in the words that are being used. I do think that in extreme cases, lust alone may be qualifying for divorce. But I think in general it's not. Otherwise, every divorce is qualified because lust is always involved. Everyone's struggling with lust. But the sexual immorality being referenced later qualifies as adultery is this porneia word, which is more physical. So I agree with you fully. I think in general that someone who is dominated by lust, it almost never stops there. And will almost always lead to something that would fit into that other category. But to say lust on its own is qualification for divorce would qualify all divorces ever. And that would make Jesus' words in a moment basically meaningless because all divorces are qualified if all it means is lust. Yeah, go ahead.
So if they're finding the sin, not legal.
Yeah.
All that leads to,
Yeah. Right.
and that, I can't even, I just remember I say
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
But it did lead them.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm just saying, also,
Yeah,
that
I agree.
I'm saying,
Yep.
and I say,
Yep, I agree.
not fighting that sin.
Yeah. I think it's a consistent biblical teaching that sin begets sin. That, it's almost a one-to-one comparison with drug abuse, where it starts little and it increases steadily. And in general, drug use begets more drug use, begets more drug use, and it's outside of some miraculous work of the Spirit, that path tends to continue. And that's true of all sin. That in general, sin produces sin much more often than sin produces righteousness. And so there has to be some moment that stops the train from rolling down the tracks, which the Bible calls repentance. Otherwise, like you're saying, it will just get worse. It's not going to stay the same. It's certainly not going to get better on its own without the Spirit. That's the path that sin takes. The wages of sin is death means more than probably we know that it means. What else? Yeah.
What if it's like, what if you like divorce
Yeah. Yeah. Here's why I would probably tell them to stay married, because the majority of marriages throughout history and probably at least a fair amount of the ones that Paul had in mind were that way. And so his message was the same. We don't like that in the 21st century, where it's all about, where you find your romantic loved one that's the other half of your soul, which is all baloney. But that's probably the reality, that he was dealing with people that didn't want to be married because they didn't like him. And so I'm kind of pushing back in this series, kind of pushing back against the strong stance. But I do want it to be clear that the disciples responded to Jesus in shock because his stance on divorce was so strong. They were like, well, you should never get married because it's possible that you could end up in an unhappy unhappy marriage and not be able to get divorced. And Jesus was like, yeah, that is possible. So I think it's possible. I think it's more than possible.
Religions like that have lived together for 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Understand each other.
Yeah, right. And the main thesis is that, again, contrary to modern stance on it, the main reason you get married is not to make you happy. That's not the main reason that God talks about marriage. It's to make you holy more than it's to make you happy. And oddly enough, difficult marriages often make you holy quicker. What else?
I appreciate the question. Situations like that, when I mentioned, you still have those out there that believe that.
Yeah.
Islam's one.
Yeah.
That believes that, and you may actually run across it one day and have somebody.
Right. Like that polygamous case we talked about last week.
Yes.
That stuff's coming. And we've I think the Bible is, it's almost like it was written by God, where it gives us the ability to use wisdom and flexibility in a world full of just sinful and messy people and situations. And not to have to say, look, I know you're getting beat with an inch of your life every day, but he's not cheating on you. Like, I think that's never the point of Christ, never the point of the New Testament. I think we've kind of ruined that. And again, it's out of a desire to fidelity to the word, and there's beauty there, but I think we've done what the Pharisees did with the Sabbath very often. Okay, next subject, which I'm excited about, is hell and then heaven. Okay, so we won't stop in hell. We're going to move forward into heaven. I don't know if anybody else will. We'll talk about that. But we're going to talk about hell first. There's three basic views historically that we're going to talk about. I've at least moved already in my beginning. I've spent, who cares? I've begun research into this, and I think you'll find it fascinating. There's three options. I think two of them are legit. I think one of them is probably dumb, but I think two of them are legit, and you could possibly hold and still be Christian. But we'll talk about those things and disagree and all that stuff. Would be fun. But I do need a little time to research that. So the plan for next week, just to make sure you come, is I have to teach a class next Tuesday on the options for what Revelation means. So I'm going to do that on Wednesday as well. So we'll talk about on Wednesday your options for what Revelation means. And unlike most groups, we don't. You can believe basically what you want about Revelation and come to church here. A lot of churches you kind of have to make a call, but here you don't. There's options, and that's kind of fun. All right. Any thoughts, questions, comments, remarks, disagreements, debates, additions, omissions, etc.? Okie dokie.